Hello and welcome to this presentation outlining HND Level 5 Unit 34, which is entitled Research Project. This presentation is a brief overview of the unit and all its learning outcomes, trying to make you aware of the requirements of the unit, coverage and the workloading involved. This is a double unit, so that means the total study time for the unit is 300 hours. You will study in class 60 hours, so that means that self-study is 240 hours, or in other words, your self-study requirement is 8 hours per week. Throughout the duration of Unit 34, please make sure you back up all your work. It's very important that you take responsibility from day one to back up your work. And one thing you will have to get used to with Unit 34 is to read and read again. The whole essence of research is associated with engaging with the literature, so you need to read and read again the literature to ground yourself and become essentially an expert in your particular field of knowledge. Here's a brief overview of the presentation. We'll start off by reviewing the learning outcome grid given to us. There are 4 learning outcomes in this unit. We will highlight the core textbook. It's actually an online textbook for this unit, and also the project background information file we will supply you. We will summarize the learning outcome deliverables you'll be expected to produce and submit for assessment. We will introduce the quantitative and qualitative research methods, and also highlight the difference between primary and secondary literature sources. We'll outline the use of Google Scholar, which is an internet searching facility for looking at journal articles, peer-reviewed journals, and also mention bibliographic packages. We will consider project initiation considerations, the timeline, the flowchart of the process involved, and the requirement for using the logbook. One of the main elements of Learn Outcome 1 you need to engage with is developing a project proposal, and we will outline a project proposal blank and all the entities required to be completed, and we will also show you an example of a student's project proposal for Learn Outcome 1. Students have very kindly allowed us to use some of their work to help illustrate the deliverables associated with this unit. Finally, just going to provide some hints on developing research questions, because that's a fundamental aspect of the project proposal, and they can take weeks to develop, and this is why you need to read and read again to become knowledgeable about your field of study, and so develop relevant and engaging research questions. Let's briefly review the learning outcomes and assessment criteria grid that's given to us. There are 4 learning outcomes in this unit. Here's learning outcome 1. We're asked to conduct the preliminary stages involved in the creation of an engineering research project. There are 2 pass criteria we need to satisfy to pass learning outcome 1. The P1 is to produce a research project proposal that clearly defines a research question or a hypothesis. In criterion P2, we're asked to discuss the key project objectives, the resulting goals, and the rationale of the project. This will all be within the project proposal you will produce. Merit criterion M1, we're asked to analyse the project specification developed and identify any project risks. And distinction criterion D1, we're asked to produce a comprehensive project proposal that evaluates and justifies the rationale for the research. Here's learning outcome 2. We're asked to examine the analytical techniques that are used to work on all stages of the project and the strategies required to overcome the challenges involved with a research project. Our pass criteria, we have a P3. We've got to conduct a literature review of published material, either in hard copy or electronically, that is relevant to your research project. P3 is a very demanding criterion. It really does want you to totally engage with the literature review associated with your subject area and immerse yourself in the various articles and published information associated with your subject area. This is where the read, and read again philosophy is paramount. Past criterion P4, we're asked to examine appropriate research methods and approaches to primary and secondary research. M2, we're asked to analyse the strategies that are used to overcome the challenges involved with the literature review stage. And M3, we're asked to discuss the merits, limitations and the pitfalls of approaches to data collection and data analysis. And D2, we're asked to critically analyse literature sources used, data analysis conducted, and the strategies to deal with challenges. Assessment grid continued. Learn outcome 3. We're asked now to reflect on the impact the research experience could have in enhancing personal or group performance within an engineering context. P5, we're asked to reflect on the effectiveness and the impact the experience has had upon enhancing personal or group performance. And 4, we're asked to evaluate the benefits from the findings of the research conducted. And criterion D3, we're asked to critically evaluate how the research experience enhances personal or group performance within an engineering context. And the final slide for the assessment grid relates to learn outcome 4, and this is all about the presentation of your research and your research findings. So in LO4 we have to explore the communications approach used for the preparation and the presentation of the research project's outcomes, the findings in other words. So for criterion P6 we have to explore the different types of communications approaches that can be used to present the research outcomes. And in P7 we then have to actually communicate research outcomes in an appropriate manner for the intended audience. This is where you'll be able to choose the format of the deliverable for presenting your research. For example, a presentation, a report, an executive summary, etc. Criterion M5 asks us to evaluate how the communication approach we chose meets the research project's outcomes and the objectives. And D4, we're asked to critically reflect on how the audience for whom the research was conducted influenced the communication approach we chose to use for the preparation and the presentation of the research project's outcomes. For your reference, the command words that are used within the learn outcome grids, such as the reflect, the explore, the communicate, critically evaluate, etc., they are defined for your reference in a separate document. There is a core textbook produced by the awarding body that you are strongly encouraged to engage with throughout the duration of the research project. It's classified as additional resources, support and reading for the unit, and it can be found on the Higher National Global website shown here. Further guidance and support on report writing can be found at the Higher National Global website shown here. The book, whose cover is shown on the right hand side of the slide here, is a very important resource for Unit 34 and should be referenced throughout the research project development. There is an electronic copy that can be viewed on the Higher National Global website. So this is a Higher National Engineering Core textbook available to you on the website. It's level 5 for the HND and it's classified as volume 2. Volume 1 relates to level 4 units. And this is a book that I would encourage you to read and read again. It has a raft of chapters related to the research process, which takes you from the initial stage, the learn outcome 1 stage, if you like, of forming a project, forming research questions, right the way through to the second stage, learn outcome 2, where we undertake the literature review, undertake the data collection analysis, to learn outcome 3 stage, when we reflect on the research process and the findings and the benefits of the research, to learn outcome 4, when we consider the various approaches to communicating our research study and our associated findings. What we've also done for you is produced a research project information document. And this is essentially a synopsis of the previously stated core textbook. What we try to do with this document is highlight the salient aspects of the research process that you need to be aware of and to engage with. It is primarily used to stimulate ideas, to stimulate a direction for you, and for you yourselves to go away and again read again around the subject areas you're considering. This research project information document is in PDF format. It's in the region of 100 pages long, has a table of contents. The first section outlines some background information related to information you need to know, outlines the unit outcomes, the unit content. It has the BTEC glossary of command words that we mentioned previously that are used in the various criteria. It has various research definitions that you might want to be aware of, and it has a summary of all the learned outcomes which we're reviewing here. The document then is broken down into the various learned outcomes. 2 is learned outcome 1. This is the preliminary stages of the research process. Within this stage, you will try and develop a project that you're going to research. You will read the literature associated with the subject area, and you will develop a project proposal that needs to be submitted and approved. This section will outline a raft of background information you need to be aware of associated with the learn outcome 1. Section 3 relates to learn outcome 2, and that's the investigative skills and project strategies required. This is where you will undertake your literature review, which is an extensive part of the research process, and you'll also consider various data gathering and data analysis techniques. These sections broken down in various steps for you that you might want to consider within the research process. Section 4 relates to learn outcome 3, which is a reflection on the impact of the research undertaken. This section defines the reflection process, outlines models associated with reflection you might want to use to help you with your reflective thinking, and results in a reflection essay that you have to undertake. And then finally, section 5 relates to outcome 4, which is presenting the research findings to an audience. Again, there are some suggestions within this section of the various methods you might want to consider, and the choice of presentation method essentially left to you. This research project information document ends with an appendix where Harvard referencing is outlined in great detail, whether referencing a journal article, a newspaper article, a television program, a book, etc. There are formal ways to define the article in terms of Harvard referencing, and you need to adhere to that format in all the work you produce. There is a proposed scheme of work within the background document. The main structure for the weekly lectures is that you have a basic presentation of a particular topic area or particular aspect of the research process you need to be aware of and start to undertake. But there'll also be time for weekly facilitation with your supervisor, where you can have a one-to-one consultation and have feedback on any work you submitted. That's the key element of the research process. It should be said throughout the research project, the onus is on you to drive the project forward in the direction you see fit. The supervision and facilitation is trying to focus you and provide you with ideas and directions in which to travel, but you basically have ownership of the research process and can drive it in the direction that you choose. We put together this summary of all the learning outcomes and the deliverables that we would expect, including word counts. I should say that in all the word counts that are stated below, the reference sections, and these will be quite large sections in most cases, are ignored. So references are not included in the word count. So for example, learning outcome 1, this is where you will develop your project proposal. We expect you to produce a proposal of between 1,000 and 1,500 words that clearly defines a research question or questions or a hypothesis, and includes discussion of the key project objectives and the resulting goals and rationale for the project. If you want to attempt the merit grade, we suggest that a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats or SWOT analysis is produced, 400 and 600 words, which relates to the project specification produced and outlines the project risks. If you want to go for the distinction grade, we suggest a full feasibility study is produced between 1,000 and 1,500 words. This would be based on the SWOT analysis and the findings therein, and then analyses and evaluates and justifies the rationale for the research. I suggest it's really further development of the SWOT analysis, but focusing in much more detail on the project risks. We strongly encourage you to remain within the word counts that are suggested here. Level 5 writing concisely and precisely is a skill we need to develop, so writing within these focused word counts is something we expect. Here's deliverables expected for learning outcome 2. For the pass grade, we have to produce a literature review, and this is a very substantial piece of work. There's a minimum of 2,500 words and a maximum of 3,500 words, and again that excludes the references. For feedback from students, this is the most demanding aspect of the entire unit. You really have to read and read again the literature, produce a literature review that is concise and coherent, that takes the reader from the initial background of the subject matter through to the various aspects of research that's been undertaken so far, the salient researchers in the field, and really into research context outlined in your proposal. Literature reviews are very difficult. There's almost an art to produce a literature review, but the more you read, the more you will understand how a literature review is formed. There will be more detail found about literature reviews in our project background document and also in the core textbook. Also for pass grade, we have to produce an essay on methodology, and again this is between 1,800 and 2,400 words, and that examines research methods and approaches to both primary and secondary research. Again, primary and secondary research are outlined in the background document and will also mention within this presentation in a moment. For the merit grade, there's an essay of 800 to 1,200 words required, where we analyse the strategies used to overcome the challenges involved with the literature review. And there will be many challenges you'll find as the literature review unfolds. Another essay is required for merit grade, 800 to 1,200 words, that discusses the merits, the limitations and the pitfalls of approaches to data collection and data analysis. And finally, for distinction grade, another essay, 800 to 1,200 words, that critically analyses literature sources that were used, the data analysis that was undertaken, and then the strategies to deal with the challenges that occurred. And again, if you refer to our research background information document, and you'll see the command words examining, analysing, discussing, and critical analysis will be defined. And you'll have an awareness of what the command words actually mean, and so how to help structure and develop your essay. Continue with our summary of learning outcome deliverables. For learning outcome 3, this is now related to reflections on the research process. For pass grade, we need an essay between 2,500 and 3,000 words where you reflect on the effectiveness and the impact of the experience that the research process has had upon enhancing your personal or group performance. Again, referring to our research information document, you'll see an outline of what reflection is in this context, and also some suggested models you might want to apply to help you in the reflection process. For the merit grade, another essay, 500 to 1,000 words, evaluating the benefits from the findings of your research. And that could relate to your research questions or your hypothesis initially proposed. It could be related in general to the body of knowledge that you've used in the literature review. It could relate specifically to the engineering context that you've researched. It could relate to applications for an industry, etc., etc. And finally, distinction grade, another essay, 800 to 1,200 words, critically evaluating how your research experience enhances personal or group performance in an engineering context. And finally, we'll look at deliverables for Learn Outcome 4. This is the presentation phase of the research project, where you're going to disseminate your findings to an audience. So for pass grade, an essay related to communications, 1,200 to 1,500 words, where you explore the different types of communication approaches that can be used to present the research outcomes. Then the actual presentation, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, could be an executive summary, could be a report. Target word count here, 1,500 to 2,000 words. Communicating your research outcomes in an appropriate manner for the intended audience. For merit grade, another essay, 800 to 1,000 words. Evaluate how the communication approach meets the research project outcomes and objectives. So that will now compare your outcomes and your findings to the originally proposed hypothesis or research questions. And finally, distinction grade, another essay, 800 to 1,000 words, critically reflecting on how the audience for whom the research was conducted influenced the communication approach used for the preparation and presentation of the research project's outcomes. So you can see from the deliverables for Learn Outcomes 1 through Learn Outcomes 4, there is a considerable amount of written work required here, documenting your research process from the initial proposal right the way through to the final delivery of the presentation. Again, we would strongly encourage you to adhere to the word count stated and write concisely and clearly within those word counts. We're now going to briefly define quantitative and qualitative research and research methods. So quantitative research methods. These are commonplace in the sciences, but they can be relevant to some non-science subjects. If undertaking quantitative research, you need to understand the rationale for obtaining numerical data and be proficient in various numerical techniques, often statistical techniques, mean, modes, median, standard deviation, t-tests, etc., that are used to obtain, analyse and present the data. So quantitative research methods are investigative approaches that result in numerical data being formed and analysed. The quantitative approach to research is very useful when obtaining measurements, for example in biochemistry and physiology, when estimating errors, for example physics and engineering, when comparing information and opinions in sociology and psychology, and for testing hypotheses, for example in investigative science disciplines. So generally speaking, when using the quantitative research approach, we commence with a hypothesis, we define a research study that then will lead to either proving or disproving that hypothesis. Qualitative research and research methods. These are used in a wider range of art, social sciences, educational and scientific research work. When undertaking this type of research, we need to understand the rationale for obtaining descriptive data and be familiar with the main techniques used to obtain, analyse and present these data. So unlike quantitative work, which relates to numerical data and numerical analysis, qualitative research methods are those that investigate approaches where the outcomes are summarised in textual information. So qualitative approaches are especially useful when explaining complex information that needs to be disentangled in order to make some sense of it. So typically, qualitative research methods might be used to find opinions, feelings, and values of participants in a study, to find participant interactions and responses, for example in psychology and sociology, to search for behavioural patterns in anthropology, ethnography, geography, looking for processes and patterns, for example in economics and education, and case studies that include critical incidents. Again, that can occur in education, nursing, and social work. There is a range of methods for data collection analysis that have been developed in each of the above areas. And if conducting this type of research yourself, it will be useful to have a thorough understanding of the theoretical base from which qualitative study methods have grown. Again, referring to the core textbook or a research project information document, you'll find more information about qualitative and quantitative methods. Let's consider the difference between primary and secondary sources of data. Primary sources are where ideas and the data are first published. So primary literature in your subject area may be published in the form of papers or articles in peer-reviewed journals. Such primary literature is refereed by experts in the author's academic peer group. These referees check the accuracy and the originality of the work produced, and they report their opinions back to the journal editors. Such a system helps maintain the reliability and credibility of the research being published, but it's not perfect. Books, or more rarely, articles in magazines and newspapers, can also be primary sources. This depends on the nature of the information published rather than the medium. So it could be that a researcher that's eminent in the field of your study has published a book or has written a newspaper article, and that holds some credibility in the research context as primary source data. Such sources are not formally refereed, although they will be read by editors and lawyers to check for errors and legal implications of the content. Primary sources of data continued. Original materials that have been published to provide information to a wide but not necessarily expert audience can also be considered primary sources. For example, parliamentary white papers issued by the government, financial statements, public inquiry reports, epidemiological reports, all are considered primary sources, that they provide raw information, raw data, without interpretation by others. This kind of material allows you, as the researcher, to come to an independent and sometimes original conclusion by analysing the data. Such documentation is particularly important in the arts and social sciences, where incisive interpretation can be an indicator of critical thinking and hence the quality of the research. Let's now consider secondary sources of data. Secondary sources generally quote or adapt, interpret, translate, develop, etc. information from the primary sources. And it's the act of recycling the data that makes this a secondary source, rather than the source's medium. Reviews of primary data are considered examples of secondary sources in the academic world, and textbooks and magazine articles are often typical examples of this type of secondary source. However, as mentioned on the previous slide, sometimes textbooks can be considered primary sources, depending sometimes on the eminency of the author. So as people or researchers adopt, modify, translate and develop information and ideas from primary sources, alterations are likely to occur, whether intentional or unintentional. Most authors of secondary sources do not deliberately set out to change the meaning of the primary source, but they may do so unwittingly. Other researchers may consciously or unconsciously exert their bias in their reporting by quoting sources' evidence, primarily on one side of a debate. However, it should be noted that modifications to primary sources while creating secondary sources could involve adding valuable new ideas or insights and content, or indeed correcting errors in the primary source. But whether we're dealing with primary sources or secondary sources, we need to read and read them again so we clearly understand the context, the data and the arguments that are being made in the sources. Sometimes a secondary source, such as a magazine article or a newspaper article, might be the inspiration for a research project, from which then primary sources may be researched and then form the basis on which to develop a research proposal. Just a very brief overview of examples of data analysis methods for quantitative or qualitative research. Usually statistical analysis, mean, modes, median, standard deviations, t-tests, etc. relate to quantitative research. So this will involve analysing data that has been collected in a statistically valid manner. That might be from experiments, from surveys, from observations. The term meta-analysis is often associated with quantitative research, although it can be associated with qualitative research. In quantitative research, it's to statistically analyse results of a large collection of studies, but it only applies to studies that have collected data in a statistically valid manner. And again, that's part of the credibility of the data collected and analysed that is peer-reviewed. A thematic analysis is associated with qualitative research. In thematic analysis, we analyse data collected from such methods as interviews, focus groups, textual sources, to try and understand general themes in the data and how they are communicated. So if, for example, you're trying to understand the problems that students have when progressing from a BTEC program to a university program, you may want to undertake interviews with selected students that have undertaken that route, and from that you try and understand the problems they have and then try and categorize them in terms of themes. Are they cultural problems? Are they technical problems? Are they logistic problems, etc., etc.? But you do that by looking at the raw data from the interviews and trying to perform a thematic analysis. What are the main themes that arise when engaging with the data? And finally, something called content analysis relates to either quantitative or qualitative research. And this is used when we analyse large volumes of textual or visual data collected from surveys, literature reviews, or other sources. It can be quantitative in that it could be reviewing word frequency in the data, or it could be qualitative, looking for meanings of the words used in the data. So as I said, that's just a brief overview of research methods for analysing data. Okay, so now we're aware of primary sources of data and secondary sources, but of course we have to be able to find the sources to begin with. There are various databases that can be accessed to find various journal articles that are peer-reviewed. JSTOR is one such database, but sometimes you have to pay to actually download the articles. So a suggestion to start your research is to use Google Scholar. The Google Scholar facility provides a very simple way to search for scholarly literature, and that includes peer-reviewed literature. The Google Scholar search engine searches across a wide variety of disciplines and sources for articles, for theses, for books, etc., etc. Hopefully from this you'll be able to find primary data related to your subject area that can be accessed for free. Try to ensure that any articles that you do find are peer-reviewed. This is usually stated by the journal. A brief overview of bibliographic software packages. Bibliographic citation management software can be extremely useful in ensuring that all literature sources that have been accumulated are organized in a structured way. And you'll find as the research unfolds that's absolutely essential because of the sheer quantity of literature sources, journal articles, reports, etc. that you will be reading. Note that Microsoft Word does have an inbuilt citation facility that some students find quite useful. This is part of the Word package. It allows you to enter references and then cite the references in the text as required, so it builds up a database associated with your Word package. There are, though, several popular and widely used software packages that are available, such as EndNote, ProCite and RefWorks, but some of them are not free to use. You have to actually pay a subscription. But a package called Mendeley is increasing in its popularity as it's a free download and it works as an add-on to Microsoft Word. So you may want to consider that as an option for a bibliographic package. Essentially, these software packages are used to manage bibliographies and references within writing essays, articles, etc. So once again, I would strongly encourage you to research bibliographic software packages and find one that you think will be suitable for the research you're going to undertake. Any bibliographic software package is better than none. Let's consider development of the project timeline and keeping a logbook. I would strongly encourage you to commence your project research diary or logbook as soon as possible. Try and capture all the aspects of your research you're undertaking on a weekly basis, as this will be very useful as a reference source as you progress your project, but also when you come to learn outcome 3 and you have to reflect back on your process, looking at the good and the bad points, etc. Having a detailed logbook will be a very useful asset for that particular part of the research process. So within your logbook, I would encourage you to highlight potential risks to the project as you progress. Very early on in the research process, you should undertake a preliminary literature review. You need to research the literature and come up with an initial literature review that starts to shape and structure your proposed research study. As I've already mentioned on the previous slide, you should have a process of organising and recording your literature right from the beginning. So again, this is where the bibliographic packages are very useful. As part of your initial project development and part of your project proposal, you will have to review the ethical considerations associated with your research. In some cases, you may need to complete an ethics application form. I would also encourage you to produce a Gantt chart of the various stages or activities that are expected to be undertaken as your research unfolds. This will help you monitor your progress and keep you on schedule. As a suggestion, we could use the BTEC Logbook we used in Unit 4 to monitor the design project process we undertook. And again, that will capture your thought processes, the problems you've had, the progress you've made as the project unfolds. Here's a proposed flowchart and timeline of the research process to be undertaken. So learning outcome 1, which essentially relates to developing a project proposal, has been given 7 weeks. Learning outcome 2, which essentially relates to the development of a literature review and also examining appropriate research methods, have been given 10 weeks. Most students seem to find the literature review in Learning Outcome 2 the most demanding aspect of the overall process, and it really will be quite time consuming. This is where you need to read and read again the literature to form a clear, concise and coherent literature review for the reader. Learning Outcome 3, which is a reflection on the impact of the research experience on personal and group performance, has been given 7 weeks. And finally, Learning Outcome 4, which requires you to explore various communication approaches used to present the outcomes of your research, and indeed for you to choose one particular method to present your outcomes to a defined audience, has been given 6 weeks. As we mentioned earlier, I would encourage you to develop a Gantt chart based around these 4 learning outcomes and the timescales given, and break that down into the very detailed steps you think you will require to complete each of the learning outcomes. This Gantt chart should be monitored throughout the project process and updated as required. These week numbers here relate to summative dates. When the assessments are actually issued to you, you will also have stated formative dates that you can use to obtain feedback on your submissions. So for the last part of this presentation, let's consider the Learning Outcome 1, conduct the preliminary stages of research project. So we know we have to produce a research proposal that clearly defines a research question or a hypothesis, depending if you're undertaking a qualitative or a quantitative analysis. We have to discuss the key project objectives, the resulting goals and the rationale used. And we need to analyse the project specification, identifying any project risks. And finally, produce a comprehensive project proposal that evaluates and justifies the rationale for the research project. We've been given 7 weeks to produce this project proposal for Learning Outcome 1. So let's consider the development of a project proposal. And the next few slides outline the expected content of a project proposal. What I'm showing you here, and will be continued on the following slide, is a blank of a project proposal that you can access, and you have to put your own responses into the right-hand column. So on the left-hand side, we have the basic component of the project proposal, and on the right-hand side, we have proposed responses. What I'm going to do here is take you through a generic responses for a project proposal, and then we will look at an actual student's final project proposal submitted. So first of all, we need personal details. This is so we can be identified and contacted. Details of the course of study being undertaken. We need the proposed title. And it should be noticed that this can evolve, particularly if you're dealing with qualitative work, where the more you read and engage with the literature, you may find that the title needs to be adjusted to accommodate a new direction of thought. The title doesn't evolve so much in quantitative work. Then we need a description of the subject area, summary, background, brief review or statement of the problem that's to be addressed. Then we need the aims of the research. Now the aims are very broad in nature, provide a general description of the overall purpose or the outcome, what's sometimes termed a statement of intent. And then we need the objectives. These are specific outcomes or a hypothesis or research questions that we expect to fulfill in order to achieve the stated aim. As always, make sure you keep reading and reading again while you're compiling the project proposal. The more you read the literature and engage with the literature, the more you will ground your study and make it very purposeful and relevant. Here's a project proposal continued here. Literature sources that have to be examined. This might be examples of sources that you intend to consult during the research. Maybe you just found them, you want to engage more fully with them. It's most likely to be primary sources that are stated in this section. Then outline the research methods or the critical approach you're going to use in the study. As we mentioned previously, this could be quantitative research, so quantitative methods may be in a laboratory or experimental work, maybe a survey, statistical analysis, etc. Or it could be qualitative methods you're going to use, a single site case study, looking at specific details in a particular company or a particular workplace. You may use research methods such as questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, etc. Or sometimes mixed mode analysis is used, which is where a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods are used. For example, you could use a large survey with a vast amount of people, and from that you then may want to focus on specific people in the survey where you might want to interview them to find more details about their responses. So you move from a quantitative, which is the large survey, to the qualitative, which could be a one-to-one semi-structured interview. Preliminary reference list. This provides details of key sources that you've already consulted. And again, most likely these will be primary sources. They don't have to be, but it's most likely to be primary sources at this stage of the process. and any special resources you may require. This might relate to information sources, samples, instruments, access to people and other requirements for your investigation, especially where there might be ethical or safety or financial considerations to review. You should provide an outline of the project write-up that you expect to produce. For example, the likely section or chapter headings and subheadings that might be in a final executive summary or report, etc. Project proposal form continued here. Here are some questions that relate to the possible supervisors that might be involved, program leaders, etc. They may or may not affect you with your research project. You're asked to produce a timetable or plan for your research process. So this would be hopefully a realistic breakdown of the stages of your project, ideally with appropriate milestones and targets. As mentioned previously, suggested a Gantt chart should be included. Don't forget, in a previous slide we showed a flow chart of the breakdown of the processes involved with your research, so you could use that as the basis of developing your Gantt chart. Of course, for any research undertaken, you need a statement or a declaration that you clearly understand and will comply with ethical and safety rules. Obviously, health and safety issues you must always adhere to if you're undertaking laboratory experiments, etc. Sometimes you need the ethics committee's guarantee that they have considered these ethical details, and they may even require you to complete an ethics application form. And finally, on the project proposal, we're asked to discuss the key project objectives, the goals, and the rationale, and analyse the project specification, identifying project risks. It was suggested previously that a SWOT analysis and a feasibility study of the proposed project specification, and that you clearly identify potential project risks within the SWOT and feasibility analyses. So what we're showing there is the overview of the project proposal that you need to complete for Learning Outcome 1. And also with the project proposal, you should include a list of references. This would be a full list of references used in the development of your project proposal, background reading, etc. And the format of the references should be in the Harvard referencing style or similar. I would encourage you to become familiar with the Harvard referencing system. Generally, the Harvard referencing system lists citations in the format of the author's name, first initial, year of the publication, the title of the book, article, etc., city of the publisher itself, and sometimes the pages that have been referred to. Citations in your references are listed in alphabetical order, and again, this is one of the benefits of the bibliographic packages. If you insert a reference within your text, the bibliographic package will search the text, find all the references, and list them in alphabetical order in the appropriate formats, such as the Harvard referencing system. You will find the Harvard referencing system in the appendix of our research information document, but you can also Google the Harvard referencing system. Here's just a couple of examples of using the Harvard referencing system. As mentioned previously, one of the salient aspects of the research proposal is endeavouring to produce research questions, the RQs. This particularly relates to qualitative research studies. These are essentially the foundation of the research and on which the entire research will evolve and eventually the outcomes will be derived. Getting started or developing the research questions is not an easy process. This is where you need to read and read again the literature associated with the body of knowledge that you're intending to research. You may have an idea for a research project, but you need to ground it in the literature. Be aware of the historical context of the literature, how literature has evolved to present day times, and how your research embeds itself in the literature. So from that engagement with the literature, hopefully you will generate some research questions. Typically 2 or 3 research questions should be generated. Again, if you Google development of research questions, you'll find various techniques and methods that suggest how to devise your research question. This one here I found is called the FINER model. It suggests that good research questions are founded on the attributes of being feasible, being interesting, being novel, being ethical, and being relevant. So below is a very generic suggestion of how to develop research questions using the FINA model. So RQ1 might be to research how some entity X, is applied, is compared, is contrasted, is perceived from a holistic perspective. RQ2 might be to research how entity X is applied, compared, contrasted, perceived in a local context, e.g. where entity X is proposed to be applied or analysed. And RQ3 might be to consider the benefits and the problems of implementing entity X into a local context, and so develop a strategy to aid successful implementation. So essentially, research questions has gone from the macro to the micro. In other words, from a holistic perspective, maybe a worldwide international perspective, through to a local context where entity X is being applied. If that FINA model helps you generate your research questions, then use it. But feel free to generate them any way you like. Do bear in mind that research questions will be proposed, and the more you read the literature, the more likely they are to change. So the research questions are effectively an iterative process. Here's an illustration of research questions based on the approach shown on the previous slide. So our research title here is a study into the implementation of a sustainable recycling plant within a remote coastal community in advancement of a zero carbon economy. The aim is to research how sustainable recycling plants have been implemented at various worldwide locations, and to use this knowledge and understanding to aid development of a sustainable recycling plant in a remote coastal community. Now I've got a specific title and our broad aim of the research. So now I consider our research questions, RQ1 I've termed this one. What are the advantages and disadvantages associated with implementation of sustainable recycling plants from a worldwide perspective? RQ2. What are the benefits and concerns related to implementation of a sustainable recycling plant in a remote coastal community? And finally, RQ3. What strategic planning would be required to implement a sustainable recycling plant in a remote coastal community? So once again here, our research questions, RQ1 is at the macro end of our study, and we end up at the micro end with RQ3. So RQ1 will require us to engage with literature to find as much information as we can about how sustainable recycling plants have been implemented on a worldwide perspective, trying to highlight locations of the plants around the world, why they are there, what the local catchment is for recycling, assimilating the benefits and the problems that have been associated with the implementation of these plants, and where hopefully a very broad picture can be obtained, and this aids our knowledge and understanding in this context. So now, taking the knowledge base of RQ1, we can apply it to RQ2. Hopefully this will then highlight the benefits and concerns we would have about implementing in the local context. Now, with our knowledge generated from RQ2, we consider RQ3. How would we actually go about implementing the sustainable recycling plant in the local context? What are the issues and the factors that we need to overcome to be able to undertake this implementation? So hopefully this has provided you with a little insight into how to go about trying to generate research questions, particularly those associated with qualitative studies. On the next slide are more examples of research questions that's been generated, this time by students. What we're now going to show on the next few slides are research questions, RQs, from past students' research projects. And I first of all like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all the students that kindly permitted us to use their work as illustrations in this presentation. It's much appreciated. What I will do is let you read through the slides at your own pace. Here are extracts from 2 students' research proposals. This is student AG with the 3 research questions and student JH with 3 research questions. I'll let you read them and consider them at your own pace. Here are more research questions from past students' research projects, research questions from student FH and from student JK. Again, I will let you review them at your own pace. And the final batch of research questions from past students' research projects, this is student MM and student GS. And finally, we have a project proposal related to smart farming technology to be applied to the Alaman agricultural sector. I very much appreciate student GS for giving us permission to use his full project proposal for your reference. Certain details have been redacted, but overall this is the essence of the proposal he put forward. Again, I would encourage you to start the presentation and read the following slides at your own pace, thinking very carefully through how the proposal has been evolved, and also think of the level of detail or the amount of reading that has gone on to generate the proposal. This proposal follows the format shown on the previous slide, but the responses here are all from student GS. So here we have the proposed title. Here is a description of the subject area being considered. Here is the aim of the research and the research objectives in terms of 3 RQs. Here is a list of the literature sources that are to be examined. This would be from the preliminary literature review. Notice how extensive the literature sources are here to be examined. Here are the research methods proposed. Initially a questionnaire, followed by interviewing. And here is the preliminary reference list that has been used to help generate this proposal. Section relates to indication as to whether discussions has already taken place with a nominated supervisor. Students' project proposal continued here. Notice that the timetable plan refers to the Gantt chart, extract shown here. In this particular case, the student has completed an ethics application form. Discussion of the key project objectives, goals, rationale, and analysis of the project specification identifying project risks has been redacted here, but there was an extensive section included. And finally, this is a list of references that was included at the back of the project proposal. So again, you can see extensive reading has been undertaken. The student has read and read again here. Each of the references shown are in the Harvard referencing system. Notice they're in alphabetical order of the researcher's last name. This section would have been generated automatically by a bibliographic package. Here's extracts of the ethics application form. For example, you must ensure that participants' data is treated as confidential and anonymous. You must always ensure that participants have a realistic opportunity for voluntary informed consent to partake in the research, and also consider whether discomfort or distress may result from participating in research. These are all ethical considerations, and there are many more to review. Here are the main references used to help generate this presentation. Essentially the awarding body specification and the core textbook. I hope this presentation has been of use to you in highlighting awareness of the requirements of the research project. Don't forget to refer to your research project information document for further reading and also the core textbooks from the awarding body. And yes, one final time to remind you, when you're undertaking research, you will need to read, and yes, read again. I hope you will fully engage with this unit as a potential to develop your research skills and your writing skills and to have some fun along the way.